What's happening, folks? It's your boy Jack Slack, Fights Gone By Podcast, episode 124. Coming at you on a surprisingly sunny Monday morning in the UK. Meandering towards Brexit next week. And of course, is that this week? Fuck. Oh, no, next week. And then the UFC London is this week, which I'm really looking forward to covering in the next podcast. And probably in some kind of article. Alright, weekend of fights. Like we said last week, you know, it wasn't the most exciting selection of fights possible, but that it was certainly interesting at least. And there were a couple on this card that were pretty good. So we'll do a little bit of news, and then we'll jump into the recaps, and then we'll do some questions. The huge. Right, what's happening in the news? Oh, Andrew Yang, Democratic presidential candidate, or rather someone who's going to run in the Democratic primaries, tweeted, MMA fighters in the UFC receive only 10 to 15% of the revenues versus the 50+% or plus 50% or whatever in other sports. I would apply the Ali Act to MMA and allow fighters to unionize. Firing Leslie Smith when her opponent didn't make weight was clearly retaliatory. Dana White should stop boasting about revenue, and he tagged those two people. Which was big news, and that's a good way to win people over. The MMA demographic is passionate. Even like the ultra right-wing people in the MMA are still like, yeah, fighters probably aren't paid enough. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed him and Ariel going at it in the replies. I don't think Dana actually replied to it. Leslie Smith did, obviously. Nate Quarry and John Fitch were there going, actually, we need an association, like they always do on every piece of news. I'd be interested to find out where this guy stands on the worsening climate crisis and the guillotining of billionaires. And, you know, if we're getting closer to that sort of territory, he might be my man. What else is going on? Oh, the featherweight division is moving along at a rate of knots in absence of Max Holloway. We got two bookings this week, or two suspected bookings. Brian Ortega versus Zabit Magomedsharipov, which is a fun one, for UFC 238. And then Aldo versus Volkanovski, because they want to bump off Volkanovski as a prospect rather than Zabit. Even though Volkanovski probably the better prospect, if you know your apples and you've been watching. My reaction to this was, please Aldo, don't hurt him. Because this is Jose Aldo's role now. I just ruin the division for Max Holloway before he can get any fights. But Zabit versus Ortega sounds good, because you got the big banger / ground fighter with the more nuanced wrestler and top player whose boxing is probably a little bit short. I don't know where I stand. Both of them have got passable hands, but not the kind of hands that get slacky to sit upright and care. But I think that's about as good a stepping stone match to a title shot as you can give Zabit, because chances are he can keep Holloway from taking him down, and Holloway on the feet, not terrifically pretty. I mean, if it ends, it'll probably be a co-main event or something like that, so you're 3 rounds, so you're probably a bit safer. 5 rounds, I might edge towards Ortega, because Zabit has regularly shown fairly his cardio's come up short a few times. Not in the sense that he's fallen apart completely, but just in the sense that he's not nearly as dangerous in the latter stages of round 2 as he is in the start of round 2 and throughout round 1. I called him Zabit there. I'm going to call him Zabit, because that's what we do on this podcast. He's the Zampant Zabit. Aldo Volkanovski is... that seems like a tough fight for Volkanovski, because you've got a guy who's incredible at stopping takedowns against a guy whose whole and has great footwork against a guy whose whole game is pushing people against the fence, threatening short takedowns and coming up punching. Might see more kicking out of Volkanovski in that one. He does have a decent lead leg kicking game, like Dennis Siever back in the day. Doesn't really use it as much as he might. I would have rather had Magomedsharipov versus Volkanovski to decide who gets a title shot, while Holloway's fanning around with this made-up interim lightweight belt, and then had Aldo versus Ortega, because Ortega's had his title shot. You're not really ruining anything there. Mind you, I was right the other day. Well, I say right. The rumours are now pretty much confirming that they're going to do TJ Dillashaw versus Henry Cejudo again at bantamweight for the bantamweight title, so Marlon Moraes is going to get fucked out of a title shot yet again. Or stalled out of a title shot, at least. He might finally get one down the line. And then Alexander Gustafsson was making noise this week, because that's what Alexander Gustafsson does. I don't plan on fighting soon, but I will be announcing that I will be fighting. I will take on all comers in call-out competitions. He got called out by Corey Anderson said yes to that fight. And then later the same day, it was announced that he was going to be fighting, or likely to be fighting, Anthony Smith in Sweden sometime. Anthony Smith, probably the smarter fight for him. Corey Anderson, well, it depends if you want to, if you're doing it in Sweden, Alexander Gustafsson doesn't need a second half to that showcase. You could have him fight whoever. But in terms of ramifications for the division, though no one really cares about the ramifications for the division, the Smith fight is probably better. And then finally, GSP has officially left the USADA testing pool, which everyone wrote their stories meaning this is it, he's done, he's gone, forever, that's it. We'll let the opportunity slip through our fingers. When in fact it just means that if he ever wants to come back, he has to be in the pool for 4 months beforehand, so they could announce the fight 3 months out. He could have been in the pool for a month already. Or they could just do the Brock Lesnar thing and skip the testing, and then he could test positive later. It doesn't really mean anything. If this is just a stalling or a negotiating tactic, it's still just a negotiating tactic. If he is really retired, he's really retired, but there's no way to know the difference. So let's talk about these fights that happened at the weekend. There were a couple of good ones. Firstly, my boy Curtis Millender lost, and it was in a pretty Curtis Millender fashion. He is bad off his back. Really bad for such a high-level MMA fighter, and someone who looks so good on the feet. When he gets taken down, and this is something that I was going to write in my Millender piece that I've had on the back burner for quite a while, when he gets taken down, you can hear his corner shout, near side underhook. Or far side end. Oh, I can't remember. But, the underhook on the side of the leg, the trapped leg, is the one that you use to get up. They like him to take the underhook on the other side so that he can hold the opponent close to him to stop them striking it. And they shout, underhook that side to stop striking, underhook the other side to get up, and they say it in the corner to him between the rounds too. Problem is, he gets flattened out on his back all the time as a result. Really, if you're a guy who wants to get up from half guard, you need to be shrimping away, putting the knee shield in, and just doing, or at least getting a butterfly hook and starting to elevate the opponent and get up that way. Knee shield or butterfly hook are the two ways of controlling and making distance from the bottom of half guard. Otherwise, you're just going to keep getting put flat on your back. And in this fight, Zaleski did a good job of getting out in his face straight off the bat. Because Millender, if you watched him against Syed rather, and Alves and Griffin, if you let him establish his pace, he's going to methodically just grind you down with the oblique kick, with the long kicks to the head and the body, with the jab, and he really likes to establish that slower tempo and just pick you apart. Zaleski came out and threw some blows at him, threw a hard kick, and then as soon as Millender fired back seriously to sort of get this guy out of his face, that was when Zaleski dropped on the takedown, because that was the plan all along. Immediately takes him down, Millender holds on to the guillotine while Zaleski's going to side control. That's when you started thinking, oh dear. And then he gets the underhook from half guard at some point, and then the whole fight was basically him with the underhook from half guard, unable to really use it to get up. He did play some double overhooks from half guard, which is not really what you want to do from half guard, because double overhooks for you from half guard is double underhooks for them, which is just one of the most powerful half guard passes. Zaleski passes, gets his back, almost chokes him. They roll back to mount, gets back again, chokes him this time. Shame about that. Curtis Millender needs some help on the ground. The best part was actually on the subject of half guard and coaching. The Beneil Dariush fight was really funny. He was fighting Drew Dober. He's really fallen quite a way, Dariush, off that Hernandez loss, because he was a top 10 lightweight. I say it every time, but if you haven't watched the Edson Barbosa fight recently, go and watch it again, because he kicked Edson Barbosa's ass except for the flying knee. The entire fight was Edson Barbosa just losing. He'd set up his stance, he'd get jabbed in the face, and then he'd do a big circle, a lap of the octagon, and then set up his stance and get jabbed again. But Dariush really hasn't looked that confident in his last two as a result of that Hernandez fight, I imagine. And then he fought Dober last night, Saturday night, whenever it was. And normally Dariush is one of Cordero's guys, so he goes forward and wins on aggression and body kicks and, being willing to stay in the opponent's face. This time he's sitting back on the fence and trying to jab him. The jab's coming in from down by his hips, and the jab's scoring. It's quick and it's getting in, but he immediately drops it afterwards and doesn't do anything with his head, and he's still in range. So Dober can take the jab and counter across the top with they're both southpaw, so the left hand. And then he'd catch him with the right hook coming out too, and stunned him a couple of times that way. I thought Dober did a very good job setting the pace on him and looking for that counter. Ate a fair few jabs, but, if you're landing good left hands, it's all right. Not an awful lot of effective kicking from either. But when Dariush gets him to the ground at his, I think it was the second round, and starts passing the half guard, beautiful work. He gets the crossface and the underhook, which is, standard smashing through half guard, and begins completing a no-hands pass, which is where you tripod up and you use your other foot in the top of the half guard as a wedge. Your free foot, the top of it and the shin go in, and you tripod up, and then you can either slide the knee across to side control way, to knee slide into side control, or you can go straight into mount. BJ Penn and George St. Pierre both famous for this pass. You see it a lot. It's Gordon Ryan does it a lot nowadays, but if you can flatten someone from half guard and get the crossface, this is the pass. There's not really any point doing other passes because the no-hands pass is just so effective. Best part, though, was that Dober's coaches know what's happening. He's got a grappling coach in his corner telling him what to do, and they're shouting to the ref, "He's just stalling here, ref, he's just stalling," while Beneil Dariush is tripoding out of the half guard and about to pass to mount. So, we complain about the refs, lots of refs being clueless, but sometimes the corner would prefer to have a clueless ref just so that they could pressure them by going, "He's just stalling, ref, he's doing nothing." But the finish was a really interesting one because he began passing the half guard, then he switched to a Kimura from inside the half guard, then he threw himself up really high over Dober's shoulder. So it started to look like when you attack a Kimura while someone's trying to get under in deep half guard. Sometimes they call it like a deep half guard killer or whatever. But you can attack that Kimura grip and you can start trying to free the leg. And then he frees the leg, swivels round into a reverse triangle or a reverse triangle, whichever one is correct here. A triangle on his back, and gets the armbar. Really impressive little transition. So not a bad fight for Dober. I didn't think Dariush looked like his normal self. But on the ground, he's still magic. This is a guy who, did they say he got his black belt in 5 years? But I remember hearing about him, might have been when he was a purple belt, and he had a match against Crone Gracie sometime in the gi, and it was a really good match. And then he did a video with Trumpet Dan Lukehard, which was about the collar and sleeve guard that he uses. That's one of the interesting points about him and Crone, actually. Both of them very gi-centric players, when they played in the gi at least. Dariush loved the collar and sleeve guard with the foot on the shoulder, and Crone used to love dangling his legs out and looking for loop chokes when the opponent grabbed his legs. He'd grab their collar and whip it round their head. So that was a fun one. In fact, the main card I thought was pretty bloody solid. What was it, 5 fights and you got 4 finishes, whereas the rest of the card was 7 fights and you got about 2 finishes. So the main card delivered, I felt. What else happened? Blago Ivanov versus Ben Rothwell was the disappointing one. Actually, I'm gonna change my mind on that. I began watching this as sort of begrudging commitment or a duty I had to do, so I put it on and I was tuning a guitar in the background, and then by the end of it I was actually getting pretty into it. Rothwell was walking him down, landing good shots, lots of parrying. He does that very handsy guard where he puts his hands on the opponent's hands or through the space that they'd straight shoot, and as soon as they do something he parries and comes back with the same hand, and then a little combination. Looked good, and he's smashed up Blago Ivanov's face. But Blago Ivanov somehow got the decision. I'd have given it 3-0, 30-27. 30-27 to Rothwell. Very strange decision making, but wasn't that clean cut. So I'm not that bothered. Only politics can really stop Ben Rothwell anyway, to be honest. And then Nico Price versus Tim Means was a real fun one. Both of them getting caught the same way, because it was a southpaw versus orthodox fight, and they were both shooting that rear hand as often as they could and as hard as they could, and then they both get caught with counters off that rear hand. Means came out very strong early, immediately going left hand to the body, parry the kick, left hand to the head, and then got caught with a right hand in return. Took Price down. Price is always interesting on the bottom. Now that you see him, having seen him knock out, was it Randy Brown with the hammer fist from the K control? Watching him work on the bottom is quite interesting. He's always getting that knee in. He's always sort of turning. So yeah, that was fun. And then they returned to the feet, and Means did some really interesting stuff slapping. what you like to see from bare knuckle fighters and in letway and things like that. It's not as big a deal when you've got your hands like properly wrapped, but if you're going proper bare knuckle, it's always good to slap so that you've got, prior perception, as John Danaher would say, but prior perception. If you slap someone's head, you know where it is, and then you can punch them with a proper punch without as much risk of glancing off them or twisting your hand or whatever. It's about knowing where the head is, and of course you also get the bonus of your working combination without having to punch hard on each one. So there was like a few where he was just like slap punch, slap punch. There was a beautiful little combination. I said before this fight, Means is good with the elbows. Not as good as Jordan Mean, my boy, but he is good with the elbows. And he went lead hand control, turned over the lead elbow to the head, uppercut with the rear hand, lead hook like a slappy lead hook. Just beautiful stuff. But he slaps Price and shoots the left straight down the center. Price backs off. He lands another good left hand, and then he steps in, like reaching for Price, and Price swings the right hand over the top and knocks him out coming in. Really impressive stuff. Absolute banger. I thought Means was getting the better of it, but, he wasn't. He did, there were still those defensive holes there, and it only takes a good one to connect while you're reaching for the opponent or diving in to hit them as hard as you can, and they catch you first. Would watch those guys fight on any card, on any given day. That was great. Matt Schnell versus Louis Smolka is actually probably worth a talk. Louis Smolka looking salon quality with his new hair and beard combination. Matt Schnell, you got the sense that he had been told he got wicked fast hands and just believed it. Well, I mean, he does have fast hands. He clearly had the speed edge, but he was doing that thing where he stood still and threw like 5 punches, and they maybe wouldn't catch Smolka as cleanly because Smolka would be ducking or something, and then Smolka would throw out like a half-assed check hook just while he was moving his head and catch Schnell because Schnell stood in place pumping his hands. It reminds me of Mike Swick getting that knockout back in the day where he just pumped like five in a row without moving his head or doing anything clever, and then after it's like, I got fast hands, baby. And you're thinking, oh, that's dangerous to do. Yeah, really nice little submission scrambles in this one. I think the key transition was from the arm-in guillotine to the triangle, because he was losing the guillotine, but when the opponent brings their hands up, I mean, this was one of my favorites from very early on when I started training jiu-jitsu. I think I saw Barrett Yoshida do it, and Ryan Hall also does it too. But if you can get the arm-in guillotine, if you're not very good with the arm-in guillotine, and I'm not, I'm still not, and this is years and years later, but if you're not good with the arm-in guillotine, the opponent might, there's a good chance they'll bring their hands up to try and peel your hands off their chin, off their windpipe. And you can switch off so that your hands are not gripping each other. You switch to one of their hands, and then you can jump that hand with your legs and start working up for the triangle. And that's what he did here, which was really nice. And it took a couple of goes. Smolka got out of the triangle, then tried to punch and got back into the triangle, and ended up getting choked. Bit of a shame for Louis Smolka, but yeah, eyes on Matt Schnell. He's an interesting character. I don't think there's ever been a boring Louis Smolka fight once it hits the ground, though. They were talking about how he said, as long as you're moving, you're difficult to control, and he does always move. Like his fight with, that lad who fought DJ off The Ultimate Fighter. Can't remember his name right now, but you remember. Tim Elliott. And also his fight with Paddy Houlihan was fantastic. Just been in some like all-out ground wars. Up there with like Hioki Oliveira and Sakuraba Newton, to be honest. And then your main event was Junior dos Santos versus Derrick Lewis. And Derrick Lewis is so bad as a fighter, that is. As a fighter technically. He's still knocking people out. But it's so embarrassing that this guy is at the top of the heap at heavyweight. And, there's always 1,000 excuses for Lewis. Oh, he's got a bad lower back. He's got blown out ACL. And you're like, well, if you've got a bad back and a bad... I thought this in the Mark Hunt fight, and I think it again now. If you've got a bad back and a bad ACL, why are you exclusively throwing jumping kicks? If you're 280 pounds, why are you leaping through the air and then coming down on one foot? You've only got yourself to blame, Yeah, Dos Santos, body jabs, as we said, and the body jabs always set up the overhand. He does body straights too with his rear hand. It works two ways, because guys start reaching down because heavyweights are sloppy, but also guys will punch for his head when he lowers it, and then he brings his head to the inside and throws the right hand across the top, as he did against Cain Velasquez in their first fight. But he cracks Lewis with an overhand very early on. But Dos Santos was looking a bit sloppy at times in this fight. He's throwing his right hand and then he's throwing himself off balance to his left, and sort of like running out that way onto a right hand of Derrick Lewis. It was kind of like when he started doing that weird circle out and then step off in the opposite, switch stances to circle out against Miocic, but he was doing it like off weird swings in this one. Landed a good back kick to the body, lovely stuff. Used low kicks well. Derrick Lewis went to low kicks, and every fight I think if this guy just low kicked, he'd do fine because if you're 280 pounds, you can kick decently, and he can kick decently, but he decides to do jumping round kicks into the opponent's arm instead. So yeah, there's that. Wins Derrick Lewis. Derrick Lewis bends over and then tries the what was it, Pete Spratt or Scott Smith? No, Scott Smith versus Pete Sell. I can't remember. The guy who doubled over and then knocked the guy out as he ran in to finish. Tried that and it worked well. Except then they were like, "Is he playing possum?" But no, he actually was like, "I am in so much pain." And then Junior dos Santos just moved in and finished him. Very good that Derrick Lewis is no longer in like title contention. Junior dos Santos versus Ngannou, please. That would be nice. Dos Santos uses a lot of feints, which would be very interesting. Doesn't use his jab as well as I would like, to the head, that is, for someone who's going to fight Ngannou. Doesn't like follow up on his feints as well. He does a lot of... His feints are really just to set up that massive overhand swing, as opposed to like the Stipe feint jab thing. But that's a damn interesting fight. That heavyweight division is so bad, though. Just so bad. But I suppose you can have them fight while Daniel Cormier fights Brock Lesnar, and then presumably Daniel Cormier will retire after that Lesnar fight. I say fight, coronation or whatever. But not a bad night of fights, which I feel like I say every week, but I'm expecting a very good night of fights next time because it's that UFC London card, and they just stacked it for some reason. So that should be incredible. You got Dominic Reyes versus Volkan Ozdemir, the Oozman. Jack Marshman versus John Phillips. That'll be a fun one. Arnold Allen back against Jordan Rinaldi. Mark Jacasey versus Joe Duffy. That's insane, and that's like on the undercard. Man, Joe Duffy should win that one, but, can never count out Joe Duffy just diving onto a knee. Oh my god, Priscilla Cachoeira versus Molly McCann. Molly Meatball. I like Molly Meatball as a person, but she's not a terrific fighter, and really this will tell you how badly the UFC wanted Valentina to get a nasty stoppage on her record when you see Priscilla Cachoeira versus Molly Meatball. What else is going on? Tom Breeze is back. God, I remember writing Tom Breeze. Could Tom Breeze be the next big star from the UK? And then he just disappeared for a while. Well, no, he was off for like 2 years, and then he suffered a loss, and then he came back and won like unimpressively, I think. I can't remember, but yeah, he's only got one loss, but people have just forgotten about him. Nathaniel Wood's back, always fun with his switchy hitty stuff, against Jose Aldo Quinones, who's 7-2, and I haven't really heard much about, so I think that might be one of those ones. And then you got Leon Edwards and Gunnar Nelson in the co-main, and Darren Till versus Jorge Masvidal in the main. That'll be banging. So let's do some questions before we get out of here for this week. What's up, Jack? I've been following MMA for over 10 years now, and I still feel like I don't truly understand what's going on in a fight. I get the general gist of who's winning and what they're doing, but I watch / listen to guys like yourself and BJJ Scout break things down, and I feel like I'm missing so much interesting stuff. How can I better understand what's going on? Should I purchase a UFC Fight Pass TM subscription and binge watch a fighter and try to find things he does across all his fights? I feel like the answer is yes, but I want someone smart to tell me so. I don't know if this is the kind of stuff you'd answer on the podcast or not, but I thought I'd give it a try. Love your stuff. Cheers from Australia, JC. Well, it is the kind of stuff I'd answer on the podcast, and I'll do so now. No, I think your idea is probably a good one. I mean, I got good at watching fights by watching fights and having a background in training, but that wouldn't have helped if I hadn't watched a load of fights, because when you're training, you're doing it first person, and there's a huge difference between first person and third person. I would say, yeah, find fighters you like, follow them through. Half the fun for me still is when I sit down and I watch through a fighter's old fightography, we used to call it. I don't know if we can still... Yeah, let's call it that. If you watch through a fighter's fightography and you're picking up on things they do in every fight, and sometimes it'll be things like, it'll be neat tricks they do, and you go, oh, nice, I can use that. And sometimes you'll go, wow, I've watched 10 Gilbert Melendez fights, and every single time he ends his combinations with his right hand. and I don't think I've ever seen him close the door with his left hand afterwards. That could be problematic. And then years later, Diego Sanchez caught him doing exactly that. That was the one that I specifically wrote for Benson when they were going to fight. But yeah, you see things like that, which is really weird. Even the best fighters in the world have habits. We used to talk about... We don't like talking about flaws and weaknesses, really, when we're doing like strict analysis. Here on the podcast, I'm flippant and I say snarky things, but in written analysis, I try and measure things up fairly and avoid saying things like flaws and weaknesses. We talk about habits because habits are things that you can train for, even if they're not like... it's not necessarily a bad habit. If a guy throws the same thing a lot of times, and you can see, he has it's not that he has a tell for it, it's that he always does the same thing, or he relies on the same thing a lot. Or if you put him in a certain position, you know that his number one thing will be to get this and then go for that. Those are the sort of things that you can have people trained to exploit. But yeah, watching through a fighter's photography, especially if you like him, it's a lot easier. Sometimes I make myself watch through a fighter's photography because I can't see myself writing something about them. Like Usman, when I was writing the Usman Tyron Woodley piece, I was like, I just cannot be interested in this man. And then I watched through all his fights, and you start noticing the same few things. You're like, yeah, actually, okay, right, that's interesting enough. And then when you watch him against Woodley, I'm watching him going, yeah, actually, I've got a new appreciation for what he does, and I'm looking very specifically at the things he goes to over and over again, and what Woodley can do or won't do to stop him doing those. Don't listen to people who say that you have to watch regional MMA to not be a filthy casual. Watch the best. Watch as much of the best as you can. Watch loads of old UFC events. Watch old Pride events. Again, we're going back in time here, so there are people on the regional shows now who are better than the people who were in Pride at the time in many aspects of MMA. But don't waste your time watching King of the Cage and things like that if you think that's going to bore you, or you're not particularly interested in two guys on a regional promotion swanging and banging at each other. The other things are just to remember, fighting has a lot of principles. Dominic Cruz is always shouting about underhooks. Generally, if a guy has an underhook, he can move and lift in that direction, which means you can make space, whether that's on the floor or not. On the ground, if someone is flat, they're generally in trouble. If they can get on their side from the bottom, they can start working to do things. Also, watch if they're able to pummel a knee or a foot in to create space. If they can get stuff between them and the opponent, rather than just have them sitting on top of them, that's good. The overwhelming principle is that on the bottom, you want to create space to escape, and on the top, you want to remove space to attack. And you can apply that more to attacking and defending, really, like creating and removing space. Because if you get stuck in someone's closed guard, then they're going to be attacking from that position a lot of the time with submission attempts and things. And then it's their job to take away space, break you down, get an overhook. If you see a guy with their hands on the mat from closed guard, from the top of closed guard, that's generally bad. If you see a guy with their hands on the mat from the top of butterfly guard, doesn't really matter. So there's lots of little exceptions and things that you just sort of learn over time. Generally, I like to talk about control and counter control, because that's what Ray Carson, the old wrestling coach, used to say. Controls and counter controls. If someone's got an underhook, look at how the other guy's going to take the underhook away. Like, is he sneaking his knee through from half guard, pushing across the mount and things like that? Is he using a quarter Nelson or something to stretch the guy out? Is he pummeling for the underhook himself? And on the feet, generally, the guy who has the better understanding of feints and expectation and, the guy who understands that the variation in tempo and dynamic and power and real and fake, those guys do better than the guys who just throw hard all the time, generally. And then position in the ring is obviously important. Typically fighting with your back to the fence is a bad thing, unless you're Tyron Woodley. Even then, it sort of catches up with you eventually. And with those ideas, controls and counter controls, feints and legitimate strikes, variation of power combinations, position in the ring, you're basically set. You're just going to learn small things that make differences, like, if he gets the underhook from half guard, the guy can backstep and start attacking his legs. Shit like that. But these are all like case by case things. The things I said are just between like that case by case specific knowledge stuff and the overall like guy on top winning, guy on bottom losing, gravity is your friend. So yeah, just watch fights and take account of those few things. And if you really want to get good at watching fights, look at how fighters react to specific real strikes and feints. If they always slip the same way, then the guy who's showing the feints will probably work that out about the same time as you, or quicker probably. And that it was Bisping versus Vitor Belfort was one of the ones where I was live tweeting the event, and I was like, these guys are both ducking deep when their opponent throws the straight. Someone's getting head kicked here, and then Bisping did. But I hope that helps, JC. Cheers for the kind words. Dear Jack, 2 questions for the podcast. First, it occurred to me that MMA is one of the few, if not the only, striking heavy combat sport that allows for fighters to grab their opponents. Does this change striking in any way that allows for any opportunities that aren't available in striking sports that have closed gloves? Second, I was really disappointed that Cody Garbrandt was KO'd while listening to instincts that had already led him to be KO'd twice before. As consolation, I went back to watch his previous fights and saw his KO of Thomas Almeida. I realised that Almeida is another example of a talented fighter who keeps getting finished due to listening to bad self-advice. After losing to Garbrandt, he was finished by Rob Font in a similar manner. Is there any way for fighters to indulge in an urge to stand and trade that doesn't rely on leaning on their chin? I'm not nearly as much of a historian as yourself, and I'm looking for a fighter who stands and trades in a manner that is just as entertaining as a brawl, while still managing technical awareness and defensive techniques. Thanks for all the insight. Without it, I would be a know-nothing casual who is constantly wrong about fights, instead of what I am now, a well-informed casual who is constantly wrong about fights. Yeah, God, that's... Okay, we'll start at the beginning. So grabbing, when you said that, I thought, well, Muay Thai, obviously, but or Muay Thai or whatever, and Burmese boxing too, and Sanshao. But then it became clear that he meant open-handed grabbing. It's very difficult to properly grab with your hands in boxing gloves. What you end up doing is you end up controlling with, like, you still use your palm a bit, and you sort of like the inside of your forearms and things, but you can't actually grab a hold of someone like Tim Means did with the wrist the other night, and Israel Adesanya did it to Brad Tavares. Just grab a hold of the wrist. No, I think that does make it much more interesting, being able to open the palms. But again, we get into all these problems with the fingers in the eyes. But a lot of the things that you can do with open gloves are things that fighters were doing in boxing gloves years ago anyway. Over the years, boxing gloves have become more set in the curl. They try and keep you in a fist, and they've brought the thumb in because dudes were thumbing eyes. If you watch Jack Johnson back in the day, he grabs people's wrists, he grabs over the biceps for bicep control. He just grabs everything. You used to be able to like choke in boxing gloves, not legally, but you could, like, your hand was separate enough that you could do that. And half the more people came to lean on blows that were illegal in boxing because they were more damaging to at least the skin than hitting with the scoring part of the glove. In the Olympics we've had for a very long time, you have to hit with this part to score. But in professional boxing, dudes used to try and hit with the laces if they could, but then we started taping that up properly and making sure that there was no way you could do that. But hitting with the inside of the wrist and the palm was, palm healing guys with the inside of the glove. If you watch Muhammad Ali, a lot of his hooks were like with the inside of the glove. One of my favourites is if a guy goes into a deep lean, as opposed to bobbing at the knees, if they bend at the waist, you can pretend to throw the right hook over the top and slam your forearm down on the back of their neck. Ray Safo did that to Bob Sapp back in the day. There's a lot of illegal punches like that, but just trying to make use of the fact that the fist isn't really the best thing to hit people with. Even last night, or Saturday night, or whatever it was, Dos Santos, when he's trying to finish, he's throwing like hammer fists instead of his usual overhand. I have really enjoyed Muay Thai in 4-ounce gloves, which is what One are doing now. Because I feel like, if you're going to allow all the grappling, standing stuff, taking away some of that limiting on the handwork really opens it up and makes it a lot prettier and more interesting to watch. Because it's like watching two guys try and wrestle in oven mitts is a lot of what Muay Thai is like. So there's a lot of reliance on like locking their hands over each other and getting to those sort of bench positions. Whereas, getting to watch guys like Muang Thai and Yodson Klai work with 4-ounce gloves, you get to see them do what they're, a lot of the time in the gym they'll be working without their gloves on. They'll just be working with their hand wraps on where they're doing clinch stuff, and you'll see them with a lot more freedom to move their hands and work that way. So I think that's really awesome. I love that. I prefer 4-ounce glove Muay Thai in One to MMA in One at the moment, but I think that's because they got really good Muay Thai fighters over there. Not necessarily always fighting each other, but they got some good names. And the second question was Thomas Almeida and Cody Garbrandt swinging for the fences. Yeah, I mean, if you watch boxing, like, you know, there have been fighters who've been famous for getting into brawls and winning them. Like, Joe Frazier got hit a lot, but he did a good job of winning exchanges by moving his head and by using, a sort of cross guard. Archie Moore did very well by using the cross guard to invite people to come in and trade with him, and then he'd either like turn into the shoulder roll and come back with the right hand, or he'd use the cross guard and come with the left hook. Or against Yvon Durell, they had a real war going on, and then Yvon Durell steps in to like hit him with the right hand. He takes it on his crossed forearms and moves in as close as possible and like lifts Yvon Durell off the floor with a left uppercut to the body, which just puts him wins him and then allows the finish to follow. But like Archie Moore's Archie Moore had the most knockouts in boxing history, I believe. Certainly most recorded knockouts in boxing history. One of the ways that he did it was by getting guys to stand in range to be hit. People aren't going to just give you opportunities to hit them unless you allow them to open up and hit at you. And the cross guard did a really good job of keeping him pretty safe. Even into his 40s, he was fighting like heavyweight contenders and knocking them out. And that's why the left hook is the king of the counterpunches. You know, Cody Garbrandt has a wicked left hook, but he just is a dummy. He just stands there with his head up and throws right hands 1-for-1 with the opponent. If you have a fighter who gets in the habit of left hook, duck, even that is enough to beat a lot of people. If you've got a good left hook, I say it over and over again, if you've got a good left hook, you can win exchanges just on having that left hook. You could do it blind. Almeida's an interesting one because I feel like generally he does a better job of like keeping his head moving and covering up than Garbrandt does. But he does really just love to get his face in the opponent's face. I seem to remember in that Font fight, he got hurt and he was like, I'll up the pressure now on him. And you go, no, just protect yourself. I believe the crossguard has a really interesting place in MMA, with guys getting more and more boxing-centric in their striking. And if you understand the difference between range, if you're not going crossguard out of a range where he can throw up a high kick and come in over one of your forearms, if you're going crossguard when you're moving into boxing range, I think it's a really strong position that could really help out a lot of fighters because the arms upright guard just isn't really stopping blows. Whereas if you've actually encircled your head with the crossguard, you're pretty, it's pretty safe compared to other forms of guard in MMA, and it pairs so well with the shoulder roll too. But Justin Gaethje does a double forearms guard by hands pinned together in front of his head. You take a lot of blows from the side, but you can walk dudes down. Tarek Safadine did it to Nate Marquardt. Cover-ups can work. It's just the nature is if you're not moving your head too and you're not firing back, you can get your hand, you get handcuffed in place and folks just punch through the holes. Cheers. Hey Jack, you've been a boy of mine since you taught me how to fight like a southpaw about 8 years ago. I got 2 quick questions for you, you cheeky nodder. How come you almost never see MMA fighters fight like Muay Thai fighters, despite the fact that dozens of pro MMA fighters have trained in Thailand? Where is the aggressive and creative clinch striking? Matt Brown is probably the closest thing I've seen to a Muay Thai style of fighting style in the UFC. One of the only people who from the clinch regularly throws elbows, knees, sweeps and dumps. It seems most fighters have a very basic meat and potatoes kickboxing game with some low kicks. Why do you think that is? Lastly, I have heard several boxing and UFC commentators remark about how X-Fighter has been knocking out guys in training camp. I have done my fair share of hard sparring, and I've trained with several UFC fighters, but I have never seen anyone knocked out in practice. Is this practice of KOing training partners common? Seems incredibly dumb and short-sighted. Thanks, your boy Garrett. I'll answer the second question first. Yeah, it doesn't... I almost always assume folks are lying when they say he's knocking everyone out in training. Except when you see like a video of Conor McGregor go up just beating up his sparring partners. And then you remember them all being like, we update the software without damaging the hardware. And you're like, really? I could believe it like a gym like Shootbox, when Vanderlei Silva was getting ready for, the Pride Grand Prix. I could believe that he was knocking out everyone in training, but I would imagine that he also got knocked out in training at some point in those camps. Regards to the Muay Thai style, yeah, it's one of those things where I don't know what to make of it, because clearly it is possible. I have seen Matt Brown use trips into knees very nicely, and use upright elbows and things like that, but not a lot of guys do. it could be the wrestling-centric style of clinch fighting. Guys go into wrestling mode when they hit the clinch. Matt Brown his wrestling has let him down against guys like Johnny Hendricks. But then you don't see a lot of foot sweeps generally in MMA. It takes really good judo guys to come in and do it. I think a lot of fighters are very keen to like drop their center of gravity and protect themselves from sweeps and takedowns first and foremost, before they worry about striking from the clinch. Striking from the clinch generally in MMA isn't tremendously exploited, is what I'd say. It's kind of underused. A lot of guys even Kamaru Usman the other day was striking from like an over-under, just hitting the right hand to the body over and over again. It wasn't particularly nuanced. One of those things that Anderson Silva did well in MMA and Randy Couture did well in MMA, and we're still not really seeing it exploited to its fullest. But then again, a lot of guys have got... Randy Couture was beating up guys who were much worse wrestlers than him, whereas now everyone knows to fight their hands, to use the fence to prop themselves up, and to, it's developed into its own sport. But I think that, that's one of the areas where we have the biggest possibility of developing, clinch striking. And the other thing, of course, is that when you hit the clinch, in MMA, you don't spend a great deal of time out in the open. It almost always hits the fence, and then there are things that guys want to do against the fence. It's not like Muay Thai, where if they hit a corner, you're not like leaning on the corner and trying to take the guy's legs out with your hands, and the other guy isn't waiting to wall walk back up the ropes. Clinches in MMA don't last long off the fence generally, unless one guy's trying to get free. Could just be the meta. Could just be the reliance of the fence for achieving takedowns and the fence for coming up from takedowns and defending takedowns. Both sides of the equation now rely so heavily on the fence that you don't see all that much out in the open. Clinch work, that is. Can't give you an entirely definitive answer, I'm just speculating, but I would really like to see more work done in that area. But then, the guys that Matt Brown did it against weren't like top-level wrestlers in the UFC. They were really more the strikers that he met. He just sort of like... And he did flow in and out of the clinch as well, to be honest. And, he did well mixing in traditional takedowns as well. So, yeah, I just love Matt Brown. I just wish Matt Brown was still in his sort of semi-prime or whatever it was that he was in for a little while there. That Eric Silva fight is still one of my favourites ever. Cheers, Garrett. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. If you want to support the podcast and get history episodes and news on whatever I decide to write this week, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to see whatever I'm writing this week, go to thefightprimer.com. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com, and buy a Black Explosive t-shirt. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Cheers.